The Chris Watts Confession. A family destroyed in silence. In the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, a security camera captured a man backing his truck into his driveway in Frederick, Colorado. It was still dark. The neighborhood was quiet. The truck belonged to Chris Watts. He worked for an oil and gas company. He wore a plain t-shirt and moved with deliberate calm. Over the next several minutes, he walked back and forth between his garage and the truck bed. He appeared to load something inside. Nothing about the footage was dramatic. No raised voices, no visible struggle. Just routine movement in the early hours before sunrise. By mid-morning, the house would be surrounded by police. And by nightfall, the story would be national news. Because inside that house had lived a family of 4. Chris, his pregnant wife Shanann, and their 2 daughters. By the end of that day, all 3 would be missing. And within 48 hours, the man seen calmly loading his truck would be confessing to killing them. But that is not how the story began. At 1:48 a.m. on August 13th, Shanann Watts arrived home from a business trip. A friend dropped her off. Doorbell camera footage showed her entering the house alone. She was 15 weeks pregnant. Her flight had been delayed. She looked tired. The friend who drove her home would later become one of the most important witnesses in the first hours of the investigation. Because by late morning, Shanann would not respond to texts. She would miss a scheduled doctor's appointment, and something would feel wrong. At 12:10 p.m., that friend called police for a welfare check. Officers arrived at the Watts home and rang the doorbell. No answer. Chris Watts returned home shortly afterward. He spoke calmly to the officers. He said Shanann had told him she was going to a friend's house with the children. He said he had been at work since early morning. His tone was measured, concerned, but controlled. When police entered the house, there were immediate inconsistencies. Shanann's phone was inside. Her purse was inside. Her car was in the garage. Her medications were untouched. If she had left voluntarily, she had done so without essentials. The beds were stripped. The house felt incomplete. Chris continued explaining that the marriage had been strained. He said they had argued that morning. He said he had told her he wanted a separation. He suggested she might have left emotionally upset. But as officers searched the home, they noted small details. The sheets from the master bed were missing. The girls' bedrooms were quiet and orderly. There were no signs of forced entry. No sign of a struggle. Just absence. A neighbor provided access to security footage from across the street. That footage showed Chris backing his work truck into the driveway at approximately 5:17 a.m. He told officers he had loaded tools into the truck before leaving for work. The video showed him walking back and forth several times. The movements were brief, controlled. Police asked him to watch the footage. He stood with his hands on his head as the screen replayed his own actions. His body language shifted slightly. Subtle. He rocked on his feet. He avoided eye contact. Still, there was no direct evidence in that moment of violence. The investigation escalated quickly. By evening, local news crews had arrived. Chris gave interviews on his front porch. He appealed directly to Shanann. He asked her to come home. He said the girls needed her. His voice did not break. His expression remained steady. Viewers across the country began forming opinions within hours. But investigators moved methodically. Phone records were pulled, text messages reviewed, work logs examined. Chris had left home around 5:30 a.m. He drove to a remote oil site owned by his employer. It was not a typical stop for him that day. He had requested to check that specific location alone. The site contained large oil storage tanks and open land. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered another element. Chris Watts was having an affair. He had been involved with a coworker for several weeks. He had told her he was separated, that his divorce was nearly finalized, that he did not have children living at home. The double life had been carefully constructed. Financial records showed strain. The family had previously filed for bankruptcy. Medical bills were mounting. A third child was on the way. Messages between Chris and his girlfriend revealed discussions about starting fresh, about a different future. None of this proved murder, but it began shaping motive. On August 14th, the day after the disappearance, investigators brought Chris in for a polygraph examination. He agreed voluntarily. He maintained that he had not harmed his family. He stated clearly that he did not know where they were. The polygraph examiner asked direct questions. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Did you physically cause your daughter's disappearance? He answered no. After the test, the examiner told him he had failed. The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of the case. Detectives confronted him. They suggested that perhaps something had happened during an argument, that maybe Shanann had hurt the girls, that maybe he reacted emotionally. The strategy was intentional. Offer a partial explanation. Create an opening. Hours into the interrogation, Chris altered his story. He said that he and Shanann had argued that morning. He said he told her he wanted a separation. He claimed she became emotional. He said he later saw her harming one of the children, and that he reacted. That he killed Shanann in anger after seeing that. This version was inconsistent with physical evidence, but it was a crack, and investigators widened it. Shortly after midnight on August 15th, Chris Watts confessed to killing his wife. He provided directions to the oil site. He told detectives where to search. The following day, law enforcement located Shanann's body in a shallow grave near the storage tanks. The bodies of Bella and Celeste were recovered from inside the oil tanks. The case shifted instantly from missing persons to triple homicide. The nation that had watched his porch interview now watched footage of his arrest. He was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased body. What remained unclear in that moment was sequence. What happened inside the house between 1:48 a.m. and 5:17 a.m.? What was said? What was decided? What was premeditated? Because the first confession was not the full story, and it would not be the last version he told. By the time Chris Watts altered his story inside the interrogation room, investigators already sensed that the version he offered was incomplete. The polygraph examiner had confronted him calmly. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply told him that his body had reacted strongly to questions about harming his family. When he asked if he had passed, she told him no. That moment changed his posture. Until then, he had maintained steady eye contact. He had sat upright. Afterward, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His speech slowed. Detectives employed a technique familiar in high-stakes interrogations. They suggested a lesser narrative, an emotional reaction, a moment of loss of control. They introduced the idea that perhaps Shanann had harmed the children, that perhaps he had walked in on something unthinkable. The implication was clear. If something tragic happened spontaneously, if he reacted in shock or rage, it would not carry the same weight as calculated murder. For several minutes, Chris remained silent. Then he nodded. He began describing a version of events that shifted blame away from himself as primary aggressor. He claimed that after a heated argument about separation, he told Shanann the marriage was over. He said she became upset. He said he later saw her on a baby monitor. He claimed she was smothering one of the girls. He described reacting without thinking, strangling her. He suggested that everything spiraled from there. Investigators listened. But inconsistencies emerged quickly. The autopsies would later show that both children died by smothering, not strangulation. Shanann's cause of death was manual strangulation. The physical evidence did not support a reactive killing in defense of the children. It suggested sequence, control, compression, pressure applied deliberately. After this partial confession, detectives asked him directly where the bodies were. He provided directions to the oil site known as Survey 319. He described burying Shanann in a shallow grave. He admitted placing the girls inside separate oil storage tanks. The logistics of that act raised further questions. Each tank opening measured only 8 inches in diameter. The girls had been forced through those openings. This detail alone suggested calculation rather than panic. On August 16th, investigators executed a search warrant at the site. They located Shanann's grave within hours. The soil had been disturbed recently. Her body was wrapped in a fitted sheet consistent with the missing bedding from the master bedroom. The children's remains were recovered from the tanks later that day. The recovery process required specialized equipment. The oil mixture had partially preserved and damaged evidence simultaneously. Forensic teams worked methodically. Back at the house, investigators reconstructed the early morning hours. Shanann's phone data showed no activity after approximately 2 a.m. Security footage from the neighbor's camera showed Chris loading his truck between 5:17 and 5:27 a.m. In that footage, there was no visible sign of Shanann or the children walking voluntarily to the vehicle. His movements were deliberate. He walked to the driver's side, to the rear, to the passenger's side. At one point, he appeared to bend down briefly. Investigators believed he had placed the children inside the truck cab. Phone records revealed that after leaving the house, he drove directly to the oil site. There were no detours, no unexpected stops. GPS data from the work truck confirmed the route and arrival time. The distance between the Watts home in Frederick and Survey 319 was approximately 45 miles. During that drive, investigators later theorized the children were still alive. This conclusion emerged from Chris's later prison confession, because the initial interrogation story did not last long. Within weeks of his arrest and after formal charges were filed, Chris Watts entered a guilty plea. He avoided a trial. He admitted to murdering Shanann and both daughters. He admitted that the first story he gave detectives, that Shanann had harmed the children, was false. In a detailed prison interview conducted months later, he provided a more complete timeline. According to that version, after Shanann returned home at 1:48 a.m., they argued about finances and the affair. He told her the relationship was over. She asked if he was seeing someone else. He denied it. He claimed that at some point during the argument, he climbed on top of her in bed and strangled her. He said she did not fight, that she simply looked at him as it happened. Afterward, he said he wrapped her body in a sheet. He claimed that one of the daughters, Bella, walked in and asked what was wrong with her mother. He said he told her that Shanann was sick. He then placed Shanann's body in the back of his truck. He said he put both girls in the cab with him. He drove them to the oil site alive. At the site, he said he smothered Celeste first, then Bella. He described Bella's final words as questioning. He said she asked if the same thing that happened to her sister was going to happen to her. The description was clinical, detached, as if recounting routine actions rather than irreversible acts. This later confession eliminated ambiguity. It contradicted the earlier defensive narrative entirely. It established premeditation. It established sequence. It established awareness. Back in Colorado, prosecutors prepared for trial before the guilty plea was entered. They assembled evidence not only of the murders, but of motive. Financial documents showed mounting debt, credit cards near limit, mortgage pressure. Text messages between Chris and his girlfriend revealed discussions about future plans. He had searched online for apartments. He had told her he was nearly divorced. The timeline between the affair's escalation and the murders was tight. Only weeks. Investigators also examined internet searches conducted from his phone. Terms related to divorce costs, wedding songs with his girlfriend, vacation planning. A double life unfolding quietly. The Watts home, once depicted as stable suburban normalcy on social media, revealed financial and relational strain behind closed doors. Shanann had documented family life extensively online. Photos, videos, live streams. From the outside, the family appeared close, structured, but private messages later introduced at sentencing revealed tension. Shanann expressing frustration about Chris's emotional distance, Chris responding with brevity. Reduced affection. Silence. The plea agreement removed the possibility of a televised trial, but it did not remove scrutiny. The sentencing hearing allowed family members to speak. Shanann's relatives described shock, betrayal, loss beyond comprehension. Chris Watts received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 for the murders, 1 for unlawful termination of pregnancy, 1 for tampering with a body. He was transferred to a maximum security prison out of state for protection. The case, though legally concluded, continued evolving in public memory. Because unlike many homicides, this one included extensive recorded material, body cam footage, interrogation video, neighbor security camera footage, porch interviews. The contrast between Chris Watts's calm public demeanor and the reality of his actions fueled ongoing analysis. But the courtroom chapter would require deeper examination, because even with confession, motive remained debated. Was it fear of financial collapse? Desire for a new life? Psychological detachment? Or something more complex? After the guilty plea was entered in November 2018, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to consequence. There would be no jury trial, no prolonged cross-examination, no televised legal battle stretching across months. Instead, the focus moved to sentencing and to understanding why. Because confession answers what happened. It does not answer why. Prosecutors explained that the plea agreement removed the death penalty from consideration. Shanann's family had expressed that they did not want years of appeals. They did not want extended public spectacle. They wanted finality. Chris Watts stood in court and admitted to each charge. He answered the judge clearly. Yes. 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 The admissions were procedural, minimal, controlled. The judge asked whether anyone had forced him to plead guilty. He said no. The sentencing hearing that followed allowed family members to speak directly to him. Shanann's mother addressed the court with visible strain. Her voice carried grief and disbelief in equal measure. She described her daughter's love for her children. She described the shock of learning not only that her daughter had died, but that her son-in-law was responsible. Shanann's father spoke quietly. He referenced trust. He referenced the way Chris had been welcomed into their family. His words were not explosive. They were measured, and that restraint amplified their weight. Chris Watts was then sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crimes as incomprehensible. He noted the calculated nature of transporting the bodies. He emphasized that the girls had been placed inside oil tanks deliberately. There was no emotional breakdown in the courtroom from Chris, no visible collapse. His face remained composed. After sentencing, he was transferred first to a Colorado facility, then to a Wisconsin maximum security prison for safety reasons. But the story did not end at sentencing. In February 2019, investigators traveled to the prison to conduct a follow-up interview. They wanted a more detailed time. They wanted to reconcile contradictions between the initial interrogation and the guilty plea. In that interview, Chris elaborated. He described waking early. He described sitting on the edge of the bed next to Shanann. He said he had thought about killing her for weeks. That detail introduced premeditation more explicitly than before. He said he had smothered girls first, believing they were dead. He claimed they had regained consciousness. He described driving with them in the back seat, alive, confused. He said he stopped at the oil site and carried out the killings there. The level of detail was chilling, not because it was loud or emotional, but because it was methodical. He explained sequence, movement, placement. He described Bella asking if the same thing would happen to her that happened to her sister. Investigators noted his tone remained steady. There was no theatrical remorse, no visible collapse. He answered questions as if recounting logistical steps. Psychologists later examined transcripts of that interview. They noted affective flatness. They noted compartmentalization. They discussed the possibility of narcissistic traits, a need to maintain image, a pattern of avoidance rather than confrontation. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Chris had appeared outwardly compliant. Friends described him as quiet, non-confrontational. He rarely argued publicly. But private messages revealed tension. Shanann had confided to friends that he seemed distant, cold. She had sensed withdrawal. He, meanwhile, was pursuing a new relationship. The contrast between his two lives was stark. On one side, a father participating in school events and family photos. On the other, a man texting a coworker about vacations and future plans without children. Financial strain amplified the tension. The Watts family had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. By 2018, debt had accumulated in. Credit cards were near limits. Homeowners Association dues had lapsed. A third child would increase financial pressure. Some analysts suggested that Chris viewed family not as bond, but as obstacle, a barrier to starting over. Instead of confronting divorce with legal costs, child support, public embarrassment, he chose elimination. That explanation, however, still feels insufficient. Because most people under financial and emotional stress do not commit homicide. The psychological dimension of the case remains layered. Chris Watts did not exhibit a history of violence. No prior arrests for assault, no documented domestic abuse reports. Friends described him as agreeable, helpful. That discrepancy between public normalcy and private violence fueled fascination. The body camera footage from August 13th circulated widely online. In it, Chris stands in his living room as an officer and a neighbor review security footage. The neighbor comments that Chris's behavior appears unusual. Chris shifts his weight, places his hands on his head, rubs his neck. Subtle gestures. Micro-expressions dissected endlessly by viewers. But in real time, those gestures meant little without context. It was the timeline that solidified suspicion. The early departure, the specific oil site, the lack of emotional urgency in his interviews, the affair. Each piece alone might not have convicted. Together, they formed pattern. Even after the plea, debate continued in certain circles. Some questioned whether he acted alone, whether someone influenced him. But there was no evidence of accomplices, no co-conspirator charged. His own statements did not implicate another. The legal record stands singular. Chris Watts killed his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. The case remains a study in dual identity. How someone can maintain routine while planning violence. How calm demeanor does not equate to innocence. How the absence of overt rage can mask calculated intent. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, what lingers is not chaos, it is quiet. The quiet of early morning. The quiet of a truck idling in a driveway. The quiet of a man giving interviews on his front porch hours after committing homicide. The quiet of a courtroom where a guilty plea ends proceedings without spectacle. That quiet is unsettling, because it suggests intention without outward eruption, control without visible fracture. After sentencing, the house in Frederick, Colorado stood empty. The lawn was trimmed, the windows intact. From the outside, it appeared unchanged. Suburban calm remained. But inside, the narrative had fractured permanently. Neighbors who once waved across driveways now spoke to reporters in hushed tones. They described how ordinary the family had seemed. Birthday parties, barbecues, children riding bikes in the cul-de-sac. Nothing had suggested violence. That perception became part of the public fascination, because the Watts case did not follow the stereotype of explosive domestic conflict. There were no prior police reports for assault, no documented restraining orders, no visible history of aggression. Instead, there was silence. And behind that silence, concealment. The oil site at Survey 319 returned to routine operations. Workers resumed daily tasks. The shallow grave was filled, the tanks cleaned. Industrial normalcy resumed. But the location remained etched in collective memory. The idea that children had been placed inside oil tanks was difficult for many to process. It suggested not just homicide, but dehumanization. Chris Watts's prison interviews continued drawing attention. Letters were exchanged with journalists and true crime authors. In some correspondence, he expressed regret. In others, he described religious awakening. He claimed to have found faith, to have accepted responsibility fully. Observers debated sincerity. Some believed his remorse emerged only after capture. Others believed genuine guilt had eventually surfaced. But remorse, even if authentic, does not restore. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, what lingers is not just the violence. It is the ordinariness. The driveway, the porch interview, the work truck, the neighbor's security camera. No dramatic chase, no high-speed pursuit. Just routine behavior intersecting with irreversible choice. If you had watched that porch interview in real time, without knowing what followed, would you have sensed something wrong? Or would calm have reassured you? That tension between appearance and reality is what keeps this case present in discussion years later. Because it challenges assumption that danger looks obvious, that guilt reveals itself loudly, that violence leaves visible warning. In this case, it did not. It moved quietly, in early morning darkness, in a truck backing into a driveway, and ended before sunrise. As the night continues, this story settles not in mystery, but in reflection, on image, on avoidance, on the cost of silence. Thank you for listening.